Welcome everyone to the Shevchenko Scientific Society webinar. I'm happy to say that we continue to provide for our program. This fall, there will be some events taking place in our building. You will be able to see any upcoming announcements of our program on the Society's website, Facebook, and Instagram. Today, we have a panel discussion about religious freedom in wartime case in Ukraine. I'm happy to give the floor to the moderator, Dr. Andriy Sorokovsky.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our global audience. Today we have three speakers, each of whom will speak for approximately 20 minutes. I will introduce them each separately. After that, they will have an opportunity to ask each other questions and respond. And after that, we will open the floor to our general audience, and you can submit questions on the Q&A feature. Our first speaker today is Protodeacon Nicholas Denisenko, who is the Emil and Elfriede Jochum University Professor and Chair and Professor of Theology at Valparaiso University in Indiana. Professor Protodeacon Denisenko is the author of numerous articles and books on liturgical theology and religion in Ukraine, including The Church's Unholy War, Russia's Invasion of Ukraine and Orthodoxy, published last year by Cascade Books. Professor Denisenko's topic is miscommunication, religious freedom and the Russian Church outside of Ukraine. Protodeacon Denisenko.
Morning, good afternoon, good evening, and hello to everyone. I'm going to pull up a slideshow, which I hope that everyone, I'm not, oh, there it is, okay. All right, I hope that it's looking good. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to the Shevchenko Scientific Society for the invitation to be a part of this panel with an esteemed group of speakers. I am familiar, of course, with the work of Father Cyril Hovorun and also of Professor Dimitrov, and I'm looking forward to a good and productive discussion today. I want to start by trying to frame the issue of religious freedom in Ukraine and the law in terms of Ukrainian history and more recent Ukrainian history. And I want to start by talking about the inner and outer identities of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And the reason I titled my presentation Miscommunication is how to communicate who we are and how we relate to society as a church. So I want to begin by reminding everyone that from 1686 to 1921, the Kiev Metropolia, no matter how one interprets the documents and the controversies that surrounded them in the years 2018 to 2019, was a part of the apparatus of the Russian Orthodox Church. And then again from 1946 to 1989, in Ukraine, there was Russian Orthodox hegemony, which meant that there was essentially only one official narrative of one united church on the basis of reunions that had taken place. Now, we know that these reunions were coerced, but nevertheless, there was essentially one unchallenged meta-narrative on the identity of the church in Ukraine during this period of time. And so in 1989, in late 1989, when you have the legalization of the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, these two churches not only challenge this existing meta-narrative of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine in the very late Soviet period, but these two new churches resume their existing identities, which they had sustained in the diaspora and other places of the world, and then continue to develop them in late Soviet and then independent Ukraine. And it is at this time where all of the relevant parties, including the Russian Church in Ukraine, which eventually changes its name to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, begins to adapt and adjust to new conditions. And I want to emphasize that for just a minute, because we tend to be prisoners of the moment. And if we attempt to look at this in the long run, in the long historical run, it takes a long time for organizations and communities to adapt and to adjust to new conditions. And so this process essentially really begins to take shape in 1989. And in 1990, the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine changes its name officially to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And it begins the process of developing its new identity in this late Soviet and independent Ukraine. And it's difficult to talk about what this new identity is, because essentially the environment has changed. It's no longer one church dominating and establishing and proclaiming one meta-narrative on what the church is. But the religious environment itself has been transformed from one that was monolithic to pluralistic. All of the churches, all of the religious organizations had to adjust to this new reality. The state had to adjust to this new reality. And so the Ukrainian Orthodox Church also had to adjust to this new reality. And so what kind of an identity did the Ukrainian Orthodox Church claim for itself in this new reality? Alongside the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and then later the Kiev Patriarchate, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church identified itself as the successor to the historic Kiev Metropolia. It identified itself as the authentic Church of Ukraine. And again, here as a point of emphasis, if we read the official documents and also some of the personal narratives that were recorded by Metropolitan Volodymyr Sabodan, who was a metropolitan of the Ukrainian Church for most of that period, it identified itself as a church for all Ukrainians and for all of Ukraine, emphasizing the importance of embracing Eastern Ukraine. And so one of the other aspects that is important for a topic that's a little bit outside of our discussion today, although perhaps we could fold it in, is that this change occurred in 1990 when Patriarch Alexei II granted a hramota to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, granting it broad autonomy in governance and in administration. And to this day, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church continues to refer to this hramota as the basis for its statute and as its claim for independence, and today as independence from the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, as part of this historical process, immediately in 1992, when the Ukrainian Church elected and enthroned Metropolitan Volodymyr, they remained committed to the canonical path to autocephaly. And in 1996, they abandoned that path to autocephaly rather quietly. It wasn't something that was announced to the global public, but it was something that was simply dropped from the immediate agenda. And so what happens is that when you have all of these churches in a pluralistic situation, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the Kiev Patriarchate, the Autocephalous Church in Ukraine, they immediately embraced Ukrainization, especially by using Ukrainian as the official language for the liturgy. And this is an important marker of differentiation and identity between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the other churches of the Byzantine tradition in Ukraine, because the Ukrainian Orthodox Church continued to rather strongly and fiercely adhere to the use of Church Slavonic And I think it's important to note that there has not to this date been an official publication of a Ukrainian liturgikon of Hologion, Sluzhebnik, whatever word that you want to call it, service book within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And so one of the ways in which people differentiate between churches is those that use Slavonic and those that use modern Ukrainian. Now, then we have also the optics of political positioning. And again, in a limited period of time, we can't go too deep into this topic. But in 2013, right before the Maidan revolution in that summer in July, there is a rather ostentatious celebration of the baptism of Rus in 3 cities, Moscow, Kyiv, and Minsk, which was essentially a ritualization of the Ruski Mir, which has now become notorious in both academic and religious conversation. And the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was an important participant in this process. And of course, the Ukrainian media capitalized in it by capturing photos of Ukrainian bishops receiving awards from President Putin of the Russian Federation. And in the time that we have after this period with the Maidan, which I'll get into momentarily, there are more events that give the appearance, and here again we have the question of inner and outer identity and how that is communicated to the public. But the appearance of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church rejecting various platforms and identities of Ukrainization. But once again, I want to say, and I think it's important for us to note that if we look at this from the historical long run, that this is a rather short historical period of time that we're talking about of independent Ukraine. And all of these churches are in a dynamic process of becoming, a process which we might say is incomplete. And we're getting a snapshot into that process in our discussion of this law today. And so now I want to turn to the political positioning after the Maidan. And the obvious point is that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church seemed to be anti-Ukrainian, in particular by adopting an anti-war position. And so in 2018 and 2019, or even before then, there was a number of public episodes where leaders of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church refused to honor fallen soldiers in the Verkhovna Rada, which again were exploited by the Ukrainian media. But of course, in 2018 and 2019, when President Poroshenko initiates or revives, if you will, rejuvenates the attempt to unify the Orthodox churches into one Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church withdraws, decides not to participate into this unification process, which in terms of its outer identity seems to add another layer to an anti-Ukrainian position. We also might look at this, and this refraining from participating in the unification process is also an authentic exercise of religious freedom. And I'll turn to how we look at religious freedom momentarily. Now, when we turn to wartime, and I ask for your forgiveness in the 20 minutes and the limited amount of time that we have to talk about these important issues, in the Sobor, which was originally just a gathering or a Zibrania that was held on May 27th, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church declared its independence. But at this point in time, following the unification process and Constantinople's granting of autocephaly to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, most Ukrainians were familiar with the vocabulary of autocephaly and of tomos. And so when the Ukrainian church said that it declared independence from the Russian church, this independence did not equal autocephaly. And when they stated that they disagreed with the position of Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, the Ukrainian public and those outside of Ukraine knew that this was different from condemning the Ruski Mir ideology and mythology that Patriarch Kirill is known for and has been a topic of conversation among academics again. And so once again, we have this problem of does the inner identity actually, is it consistent with the outer identity of the church? Because on the one hand, the reference to autonomy, the Declaration of Independence, could indicate both the exercise of religious freedom and also some semblance of independence from Russia. On the other hand, there are aspects of the outer identity that seem to be anti-Ukrainian by refusing to participate in the unification process and not being aligned with the other Ukrainian churches and the kinds of statements in the public forums that are made about their position on the Ruski Mir and the Russian Orthodox Church. And so now I want to turn to my own conclusion to talk about some of the problems concerning the passing of this law and its implementation and enforcement. And let me just note that I'm sure that most listeners are probably familiar that on August 25th, Pope Francis expressed concern that the law would violate freedom of religion. The World Council of Churches said it was deeply alarmed by the potential for incidences of the violation of freedom of religion. And in a contentious election season, it seems that many American politicians are commenting on the situation to add it in some way as a feature of their position on foreign policy vis-a-vis supporting Ukraine and its defense from Russia's invasion. But I want to talk about what are essentially three very problematic issues that really need to be resolved. And the first is that, and I know we'll hear more about this from our other panelists, so I won't go into the details. But what we hear coming from the Ukrainian government is that they have a very clear objective, and that the objective is to prohibit the Russian Orthodox Church from operating in Ukraine and not the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the leadership of Metropolitan Onufry. And a number of analysts have attempted to justify the passing of this law by claiming that the objective is to protect the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from Russian influence. Viktor Yelensky asserted that the law would not result in the closure of 8,000 parish communities. But there are problems with this because there is a very strong reaction of opposition coming from some quarters within Ukraine and certainly outside of Ukraine. And so for some, the passing of the law appears to be a natural escalation by the state. And so the first issue that needs to be resolved, and it's related to the other two issues, is that the state really needs to identify and formulate a better communication strategy if its intent is actually to protect the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and not to force it into absorption into the Orthodox Church of Ukraine or force it into liquidation. The second issue concerns organizations, politicians outside of Ukraine. Many of these politicians, as I've mentioned before, perceive this law as an imminent violation of the fundamental human right of freedom of religion. And I think that one of the issues here is that much of the West, if you will, forgive me for a potential reductionism, understands this religious freedom in absolute terms. And so this definition of absolute religious freedom would permit unpopular positions on the war, on the invaders, on a reluctance to support Ukraine, on the reluctance to have a dialogue with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine or with the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And certainly the Ukrainian Church has exercised this freedom of religion from refraining from participating in some of these discussions. But of course, freedom of religion has two sides to it. But I think that this has to be part of the conversation is how do we understand from a media, from a global public discourse position, the meaning of religious freedom, and to bring into that conversation that many of the parties who have a stake in what is happening in Ukraine understand religious freedom in absolute terms, even if the position adopted by the religious group would be unpopular concerning the war. And then the third issue that really needs some resolution concerns, of course, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church itself. It seems either unable or unwilling to communicate what it really intends to do. Now, certainly, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has communicated its support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but they seem to have either miscalculated or ignored the knowledge that Ukrainians obtained about autocephaly, about the tomos. And so their decision to signal disagreement and separation from the Russian Orthodox Church didn't include a declaration of autocephaly. And observers have paid attention to these matters. And so I think that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and its leadership needs to signal what it intends to do now that it's in this gray zone, sort of in between, independent of the Russian Orthodox Church and adhering to the independence granted to it in the Gramota of Autonomy in 1990, which is not the same thing as canonical autocephaly. So I think that it would help, and I think that it also needs to be brought into the conversation, the matter of what do they signal? What do they really intend to do? What are their intended next steps? And also to understand that a statement of their actual objectives on next steps or continued silence on this matter might be what they actually intend to communicate, which is a wait and see attitude, which seems to invite both external criticism and continued heavy scrutiny from the Ukrainian state. And so my final observation in conclusion is that when we look at religious freedom in the period of late Soviet to independent Ukraine, I would like to describe it as an ongoing process of becoming for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but certainly also for all of the other churches and religious organizations in Ukraine. Again, if we look at this from the perspective of the long run, we're getting a snapshot into a moment, into an episode. It's a meaningful one. It's a crucial one. And lives are at stake, and I'm not meaning to undermine that in any way, but it's still just a snapshot. It's a dynamic process, or at least it has the potential to continue to be a dynamic process. And then we also have to consider the reality that religious freedom in wartime Ukraine has a demand, a call, an invocation, if you will, for transparency on all sides. And this would refer specifically to the actual objectives of the Ukrainian government on implementing and executing this law, and of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church on where it stands in terms of its relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church and with the Russian Federation, but especially with the Ukrainian people. So my time is done. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Professor Denisenko. Those of you who have questions, please save them after all the speakers have done and discussed among themselves. You will have an opportunity to have your questions answered via the Q&A function. Our second speaker is Archimandrite Cyril Hovorun, who is a professor of ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at Sankt Ignatius College at University College Stockholm. He is director of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He is a graduate of the Theological Academy in Kyiv and the National University in Athens. Archimandrite Hovorun completed his studies at Durham University. He was chairman of the Department for External Church Relations of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and first deputy chairman of the Education Committee of the Russian Orthodox Church. Later, he was a research fellow at Yale and Columbia Universities and visiting professor at the University of Münster in Germany. He is an international fellow at Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta, Canada, and an invited professor at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. His topic today is contexts and undertexts of the new Ukrainian law banning the Russian Orthodox Church. Archimand Wright, please.
Thank you. Right. First of all, thank you, Father Nicholas, for providing us with a wider context of the controversy which is unfolding. I'm going to also to provide a context, but from a different perspective, from more kind of political perspective and the perspective of narratives. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Indonesia, in a very kind of remote corner of the island of Java, in a university. It was a Muslim university. And I had a chance to explain about the war in Ukraine and about the emergence of the Russian world ideology. And then in the Q&A session, there were some questions about the war, which demonstrated that people have a rather vague idea about the war. And then the question about this controversial law came up, which surprised me. Well, to find in a Muslim university, somewhere far, far away in Indonesia, someone who is concerned about this law was a bit of surprise, which is an indication that this law has become a big issue globally. It has become a part of the narrative surrounding Ukraine. It's almost like, you know, there is a war in Ukraine and there is a law in Ukraine, you know, and they are placed almost on the same footing. And I think methodologically it is very wrong. Before speaking about the situation with religious freedom in Ukraine in general, and this controversial, indeed, law in particular, I think we need to make some necessarily kind of statements before we do this. First one is that any discussion about this law should not be done in a patronizing tone. Something that I am hearing quite often. Another conference I had just recently in Germany, we had a similar discussion, and I heard some, you know, patronizing overtones regarding Ukraine, coming from the environments where there are their own problems with the religious freedom. Like, for example, there is an unsettling situation with the rise of the left-wing anti-Semitism in Europe or in the United States, or a right-wing Islamophobia in the same environment, something that we are, I'm not aware of in Ukraine, at least. I have an impression that they virtually are absent in Ukraine. In July, I had a chance to visit the national breakfast under the auspice of the president of Ukraine in Mistetsky Arsenal in Kyiv, and I was surprised to see how on the stage there was a rabbi and a mufti, a Muslim mufti, and they prayed together for Israel. I cannot imagine this, you know, in most environments, from where I hear critique, you know, of the Ukrainian situation. So we need first to make very clear that the general interreligious environment in Ukraine is healthy, relatively, or at least it is healthier than in many other, you know, developed democracies. The second thing that we need to always to keep in mind is there is a massive invasion that causes a massive violation of human dignity and religious freedom in Ukraine, coming from Russia. And it's something that I wanted to share with you as a very brief, really, presentation, which I always share when I speak about religious freedom in Ukraine. So I hope you can see my screen. So this is a map which was produced by my colleagues and good friends from the Institute of Religious Freedom in Ukraine, where you can see the numbers of damaged and destroyed religious buildings as a result of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So this is really the context in which any question of religious freedom in Ukraine should be taken. And then I had a chance to visit some of those places. I went to the front lines and I took some pictures that I'd like to share with you, like these ones. This picture, I took them actually in the in the Mistetsky Arsenal in Kiev during the national breakfast. So they had an exposition of those disformed crosses inside the hall where the national prayer breakfast took place. This is a church which was destroyed, the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, by the way, in Komishuvaha, which was destroyed by a Russian shelling on the night of the Easter, when people were supposed to celebrate Easter there. But because of the curfew, they couldn't come, so they saved their lives. This curfew actually saved their lives. The building was destroyed exactly on the night of the Easter. The same church. A monastery in Donbass. And this is the most recent, one of the most recent destructions. A Russian projectile hit a Muslim center in Kiev. I had a chance to visit it as well. It was hit on September the 2nd. And that's what happened inside. So that's another important context that needs to be taken into consideration when we want to discuss religious freedom in Ukraine. However, it does not, I don't want to be apologetical. And I acknowledge that there are problems with this law. And I personally have many chances to criticize this law. I believe this law needs to be understood in the process of the wider political developments in Ukraine. While many political parties and many political actors in Ukraine anticipate imminent elections in Ukraine. They may happen in 2025. We don't know exactly, even though it's still unclear when the elections will happen, but the parties started a sort of competition with one another. And this competition happens in the Ukrainian parliament, in Rada, Verkhovna Rada. And I believe this law was adopted after a lot of hesitations, after many discussions in the parliament and outside the parliament, but eventually the law was kind of gained a momentum for adoption as a result of the rivalry between two major parties in the Ukrainian parliament, the servants of the people, the ruling party of the president of Ukraine, and then the European Solidarity of the former president of Ukraine, Poroshenko. Essentially, the party of Poroshenko, I believe, produced a sort of ultimatum to the majority that we would not adopt any other law, even though it is would be important for the for the war, if you don't adopt this law about banning the Russian Orthodox Church. And the presidential party yielded to this sort of ultimatum and decided to vote for this law. So I think it's a kind of the law came up as a result of the internal competition between the parties. One could say it is a normal political process. I would not say so, because I believe it is a populist law. Both parties acted populistically, and they responded, in a sense, to the prevailing mood in the Russian within the Ukrainian society. According to different surveys, there is a kind of request in the Ukrainian society from the political parties to do something with what they believe to be the agents of Moscow, of the Kremlin, including the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. If we compare the situation with 2018 on the eve of the Tomos, then the prevailing mood in the society was towards reconciliation, towards unification of the churches. Now the mood is towards punishing the perpetrators, even if those perpetrators are imagined. So there is like a demand for segregation, for separation, and for punishing more than for unification. And I think the political parties in Ukraine, they just follow these surveys and follow this line and they act populistically, I believe. Well, in contrast to this perception, which prevails among the political parties. The most recent survey, I think it was published yesterday or the day before yesterday. Yesterday I had to comment this for the Ukrainian TV. Demonstrated that around 60% of the Ukrainian population look into the unification of the Ukrainian Orthodoxy, and only 20% don't care. Around 20%. Roughly speaking. And in my comment to the Ukrainian TV, I said, this exactly reflects the situation within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Around 60%, I would say, of the people in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, including lay people, priests and so forth, they care about the unification and dialogue within the Ukrainian Orthodoxy. This is the majority, but this majority exists primarily on the grassroots level, in the communities, among the lay people, priests, and 20% don't care. And those who don't care are usually on the top. They don't want any dialogue. They block actually dialogue. And this is very, very unfortunate, I believe. So this law serves a momentous kind of populist satisfaction without really solving strategic goals. I don't think this law can really prevail, can really purge the Russian world from the minds and souls, of the Ukrainians. It's unrealistic because the Russian world, this ideology can be purged in other ways, but not through this law. So its goal is unachievable. The declared goal is unachievable, I believe. And I believe it damages quite a lot the standing of Ukraine in the international environment. I face it myself because I have to talk a lot to different audiences in the West and in Asia, in the East, and I receive all the way always the same question: what about this law? And I'm really tired to answer this question. If there are no other problems, like if there is no war in Ukraine, there is only this law. And this is really an unfortunate situation. In the last point that I want to raise, there is an unexpected positive outcome of this law. This law, formally speaking, prohibits the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Well, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church claims it is not anymore a part of the Russian Church, but there is a Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and it is on the occupied territories. So far, there were no legal frames to deal with the presence of the Russian Orthodox Church on the occupied territories of Ukraine, like in Crimea, in Donbass, in the parts of Kherson, Zaporizhia, and so forth. And I understand that the legislators did not intend to deal with the presence of the Russian Orthodox Church on the kind of, not the proxies of the Russian Church, the Moscow Patriarchate itself on the occupied territories, where they essentially converted the former dioceses and parishes of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to the direct jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Moscow. But unexpectedly, and probably without intention, this law helps to deal with the presence of those churches. It prohibits that presence. So now, after this law is adopted, like the existence, for example, of the Crimean Metropolia and the Tikhon Shevchenko is illegal according to the Ukrainian law. Before that, it was not illegal. Well, it was not legal either, but it was not it was in the legal limbo. Nowadays, I think it is clear, if not, well, maybe clearer, what is the legal status of such metropolis. They are illegal. So I think it's a kind of something positive about this law that I can say. Otherwise, it is problematic in my judgment, but it's not fatal in my judgment. Many things will depend on the way how it will be implemented. We will have to see how it will be implemented. I believe it is unimplementable, and that was probably even the intention of the law. It was adopted in order not to be implementable because it's just a declaration. It's more a populist move. So that is my take on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Once again, questions will be entertained at the end after the presentations. Our final speaker today is Dr. Dmytro Volk. who is visiting associate professor at Cardozo School of Law in New York. He is a member of the OSCE ODIHR panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief for 2022 to 2025. He is also co-editor of the blog Talk About Law and Religion. Among his recent books, publications are Human Dignity, Judicial Reasoning and the Law, Comparative Perspectives on a Key Constitutional Concept, forthcoming from Routledge. This was co-edited with Brett G. Scharfs and Andrea Pinn. There is an issue of the Review of Faith and International Affairs, volume 23, co-edited with Elizabeth A. Clark, on the topic Freedom of Religion or Belief and Gender Equality Across the OSCE Region. And Dr. Volk is also co-editor with Elizabeth A. Clark of Religion During the Russian-Ukrainian Conflict, Routledge 2019. His subject today is constitutional and legal aspects of the law on the ban of the Russian Orthodox Church and affiliated religious organizations. Dr. Volk.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And first of all, I should say that I'm a lawyer by training, as Andrew mentioned. So I don't claim any expertise, both professional and personal, in religion itself. However, I think legal perspective on this issue is important because religious freedom, all to all, is not so much about religion itself, but more about what individuals and religious organizations can or cannot do. At least this is what the Ukrainian constitution and international law thinks about religious freedom. And I think it's also good to have, to add, to complement to the global picture described by Professor Denisenko and Father Kirill, to add some, details of legal regulation and what's going on the ground, because actually I'm quite skeptical to the idea that there is a populist law that will never be implemented, because when you have law with more or less criminal norms and sanctions, there's a big chance that it will be somehow implemented, that it's a good idea to discuss the law and its ramifications. Let me share my slides. So as a lawyer, I often receive a bunch of questions about the law and its consequences, and I just want to quickly discuss these questions with you. First of all, is this a law banning the Russian Orthodox Church or the Ukrainian Orthodox Church historically and ecclesiastically connected to the Moscow Patriarchate? Second, does the procedure of banning UOC organizations fit basic rule of law requirements? Third, does the law comply with international human rights law? Fourth, is it difficult to ban the whole Ukrainian Orthodox Church based on this law? Fifth, will the law hinder Ukraine's European integration and its relations with international partners? And the final question, will the application of the law affect the model of religion-state relations in Ukraine? So first of all, does the law bans the Russian Church or the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? Short answer in practical terms is the law imposing the ban or potential ban on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. It's true that the law explicitly bans only the Russian Church, but in practical sense, the law deals specifically with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. First, it was repeatedly declared that the aim is to ban the church by the authors and promoters of the law. For example, Mikita Potorayev, the head of parliamentary committee in Verkhovna Rada, responsible for drafting the second and final versions of the law, he said that he would be happy even if the law would result in the split within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Second, the law, in particular, the criteria of Ukrainian religious organizations to be recognized as affiliated with Russia was clearly written to match the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And third, in January, February 2023, the state already conducted a religious, I would say pretty much theological examination, and established the fact that of the connection between the Ukrainian Church and the Russian Church. even after the Ukrainian Orthodox Church declared what they called full independence in May 2022, which opens the way, I mean, the religious examination opens the way to the liquidation of the Ukrainian Church according to this law. The group of experts appointed by the state recognized that nothing except the declaration autocephaly would cut ties between the Ukrainian Church with the Russian Church. And again, according to Potorayev, the state should just reissue the examination and start the process of the implementation of the law. So while the ban of the Russian Church is merely a political statement, core provisions of the law will target or would target the Ukrainian Church. The second question, does the law comply with rule of law requirements? Short answer, not always. First, the law does not provide for any guarantees of impartiality and independence of the examination regarding whether the Ukrainian Church is affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church. Neither certain expertise nor impartiality of these experts are mentioned in the law. The appointment of experts is at the full discretion of the State Service of Ethnic Affairs and Freedom of Conscience, so-called DES, which is inclined to support, in my view, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, so the competing church, independent Orthodox Church. Complaints have already been made about the impartiality of the previous expert opinion based on the fact that the majority of experts were either vocal supporters of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine or even members of this church. There could be an obvious question, so what? They are affiliated with the competing church, but their opinion is still can be correct. And I will accept it if it comes to political debates or academic discussion. However, as this is an expert opinion that has legal ramifications, which is the ban of a certain religious organization, it is expected that the state will demonstrate that experts are impartial and independent. And I would add they are supposed not only be impartial, but also demonstrate this impartiality to the public. And it's unusual to expect that, forgive me this comparison, McDonald's experts can be impartial about KFC. Second, the law is in a way inexecutable in the sense that there is nothing that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church can do in order to 100% avoid the ban. Even if the church proclaims, I'm not sure that it's possible, but still, if the church proclaims the autocephaly and impose anathema on Patriarch Kirill, from formal legal perspective, it's still not enough, because the law is very clear. As long as the Russian Orthodox Church recognizes the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as its own branch, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church can be prohibited. The Russian Orthodox Church would never, I think, recognize any sort of autocephaly for the Ukrainian Church, which means that the banning option will be also always on the table for the government. Third, the law also allows the liquidation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church communities for any violations, I quote, regarding the establishment and operation of religious organizations, which makes any even minor violation of the law a ground to impose a ban. And finally, legal protections from state arbitrary power are also not sufficient. In this law, the law establishes a simplified court procedure for the liquidation. There is only one court in the country that has jurisdictions over these cases. This is the Appellate Administrative Court located in Kyiv. This means, for example, that parishes located in Zakarpattia or Odessa region will have to go to Kyiv if they want to be present at the hearing of their cases. The court is not even required to notify them by mail, which is a common procedure for Ukrainian, according to Ukrainian court procedural law. It's enough to place notifications on the website of the Ukrainian judiciary or the DES, and that's all. Does the law comply with international standards? Short answer, not, at least as we know these standards, or as we know international human rights law. Freedom of religion or belief cannot be derogated even in times of the war and cannot be limited for reasons of national security. This is Article 18 of the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. Religious organizations can be liquidated on the grounds of national security as any public associations, Article 22 of the International Covenant. However, it cannot be done because of their religious affiliation or canonical ties. but only because of institutional involvement in illegal activities, which must be proven by the state. In addition, international law prescribes that the ban of religious communities should be a last resort measure when less restrictive measures are not available or effective. If we put aside all that discussion about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and about the law, if we put aside purely theological arguments in favor of the ban, such as spiritual decolonization or spiritual independence, then we have about 50 court verdicts against current or former clerics of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, their relatives and or closely related believers, for example, members of public organizations affiliated with the church. Although there are cases of collaboration and at least 3 priests of the church, including a metropolitan, were traded in the prison exchange to Russia, 3/4 of these criminal cases are related to so-called inappropriate speech, like the justification of the Russian aggression or the incitement of religious hatred, usually against the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Usually, these speech-related crimes have a quite narrow audience, a private chat, WhatsApp chat with several people, private communication with believers, a sermon in a village church, and are often a part of a dissemination of conspiracy theories, in particular with anti-Semitic overtones. These crimes obviously constitute serious offenses, but they are nonetheless deviate from what we usually think as crimes against national security. Even if we add to this another 100 criminal proceedings that are now at various stages of investigation and court trials in Ukraine, it's impossible to unequivocally conclude that the ban is the only adequate sanction for the religious group with 8,000 communities and 10,000 clerics. A more relevant question, in my view, and Father Kirill mentioned this, is the question about dioceses operating on the occupied territories. For example, we see in Crimea, and these dioceses, from the perspective of Ukrainian law, they're still Ukrainian legal entities, they're not Russian legal entities. So we see in Crimea and, for example, in Luhansk, that local bishops and parishes are involved in the support of the Russian military and the Russian occupational administrations. And in this capacity, they probably can be banned. But there is no need in any specific law to do this. They can be banned on the law that already in place. We already have legislation that can facilitate, the persecution of these clerics and banning those religious organizations. A separate issue here is the ban of the so-called Russian world ideology. According to the law, religious organizations involved in the repeated dissemination, which means 2 times and more, dissemination of the Russian world ideology should be prohibited. We definitely see that the idea of shared history of Russians and Ukrainians, or shared religion or culture, is weaponized by Putin and the Russian church to justify this war. And obviously, this sort of justifications in times of the war can be a matter of criminal proceedings. However, 2 questions remain. First, this sort of speech is already covered by the Ukrainian Criminal Code, and it's unclear why it's not enough, especially given the number of cases that we already have in courts regarding public and private justification or denial of the Russian aggression. Second, the law contains a broad and rather confusing definition of the Russian world. You see this definition on the slide. Russian world ideology is a Russian neo-colonial doctrine grounded in chauvinist, Nazi, racist, xenophobic religious ideas, images, and goals of the destruction of Ukraine, the genocide of the Ukrainian people, and non-recognition of the sovereignty of Ukraine and other countries, aiming at the violent expansion of the Russian supranational imperial space as a tool of the special civilizational right of Russians to mass murder, engage in state terrorism and military interventions in other countries, occupy territories, and expand the canonical territory of the Russian Orthodox Church beyond the territory of the Russian Federation. I would say, because for legal regulation, ideological bans is always a sensitive issue, and there are not so many bans like that. I can only name a few, like the denial of Holocaust or the denial of Armenian genocide in France, or bans regarding Nazi or communist ideologies. But this vague definition can be used, I would say, in quite arbitrary manner, in particular for banning religious communities for merely abstract discussion of shared spiritual tradition of Russia and Ukraine, or worshiping certain saints, or opposing to Western or European way of the development of Ukraine on religious premises. While obviously these practices and these ideas can be criticized and can be morally inappropriate in times of the war, I do think that merely abstract discussion whether Russians and Ukrainians have shared history cannot be a matter of criminal law sanctions. The first question, is it difficult to ban the whole Ukrainian church based on that law? Short answer, yes and no. For imposing a complete ban, the state will have to ban each UOC parish or organization separately because they are all separate legal entities, and it will indeed take a while to ban 8,000 organizations. At the same time, the law gives public prosecutors' offices the authority to litigate these cases in the court, and we have quite a number of public prosecutors in Ukraine and specifically in Kyiv. And as I mentioned, all these cases will be considered by one court in Kyiv. In addition, this trial should not last very long because the only thing that the court must establish in order to make a decision is whether a religious organization really affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church, which one can assume will be done by reference to the relevant examination already carried out by the state. So from the legal perspective, procedural perspective, these are not difficult cases and they will not take much time. The involvement of public prosecutors in a simplified procedure allows to deregister key elements of the UOC quite promptly, leaving the rest of the church to decide whether they want to join an independent Orthodox church, any other church, or just go underground. The fifth question, will the law hinder Ukraine's European integration in its relations with international partners, in particular specifically with the United States? Short answer, not in a short-term perspective. Given my expertise of communication with international human rights actors, the basic logic of many of Ukraine's international partners will be the following. It's not the biggest problem of Ukraine in times of the war. And this position rests on two basic premises. First, Ukraine, even with this law, has a better record of religious freedom protection than most of post-Soviet countries, and above all, Russia, which is one of the worst violators of religious freedom in the world. And second, the participation of Russian diplomats and the Russian Orthodox Church in the promotion of the narrative of the persecutions against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine will discourage international actors to publicly criticize the law and Ukraine in order not to show their solidarity with Russia. However, we also see that most, and I emphasize this, most international religious freedom actors have expressed their concerns over the law. This includes the United States Commission of International Religious Freedom, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the biggest human rights organization in the world, several Western churches, Pope Francis, United Nations bodies, the European Union, and so on. Recently, the United States delegation to the United States mission to the OSCE pointed out the following. Ukraine passed a law in August banning the Russian Orthodox Church and religious institutions tied to Moscow. We are concerned by the law's potential to collectively punish entire religious communities and blemish Ukraine's historical robust support for religious freedom. We urge the government to seek independent international review of the law. We will continue to carefully monitor the implementation of the law and sincerely hope that it's in line with Ukraine's international commitments and obligations. It's October 2023. And these concerns over the law were expressed, similar concerns were expressed during Ukraine and the European Commission's bilateral meetings in September. This is the beginning of the European integration process. So in the long-term perspective, especially after the end of the war, it can be and can become an issue. And in this sense, it's quite a challenge for the Ukrainian government because we see a consensual support of the law domestically and a growing skeptical approach internationally. And finally, will the application of the law affect the model of religion-state relations of Ukraine? Short answer, yes. The model laid down in Article 35 of the Ukrainian Constitution, separation of church and state, has long existed only on paper. During the last 25 years, and especially after 2014, Ukraine has been moving towards a cooperative model of relations between the state and the church, which is a more traditional model for Orthodox majority countries. The adoption of the law adds momentum to this movement, It seems that there is still no political consensus over this issue. Oppositional politicians, some second-level pro-government politicians, and officials responsible for religious affairs are promoting the idea of a sort of reapproachment with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And we see some signals from the Orthodox Church of Ukraine as well. At the same time, such a scenario does not seem, for various reasons, completely acceptable for President Zelensky team. I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite the speakers, if you have any questions for each other or any comments on each other's presentations, you may do so. You may go ahead and do so now. I see a hand up. Dr. Volk, did you want to?
I just have a question. I'm really interested both in Professor Denisenko and Father Kirill's opinion on that, because this is something that is being discussed all the time, that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church should have shown up at the Unification Council in December 2018 and just, elect Metropolitan Onufry as the head of this new church and so on and so forth. And on my perspective, but I'm a religious outsider, on my perspective, it was completely impossible because the process was heavily handed by President Poroshenko and his administration, and they would like to have some UOC metropolitans, but they would never allow them to somehow determine the result of the elections. So the question is very simple. Do you really think that the UOC could show up at the Unification Council and sort of take the business in their hands?
Yes, Archimand right, Cyril. Yes.
If I may answer this question, because I wasn't a sort of insider at the time. I believe there was a strong condition from the Ecumenical Patriarchate for its involvement in this unification process, that all churches should be invited and should be really encouraged, strongly encouraged to participate in the council. It is still the position of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. It still wants all Orthodox to participate in this unification process. Well, President Poroshenko at that time, I think, did something to facilitate or to encourage such a participation, but in my judgment, did not do enough for that, because what was enough for him and his political force was just to have such a council, to create this recognized canonical church. That was enough, politically speaking. But ecclesially speaking, it was not enough, and therefore I think it was not that he torpedoed, this unification process. He wanted it to happen. It was kind of his sincere desire, but he didn't do enough. I think it was a good chance. There was a good chance that the many, if not the majority, of the Ukrainian churches from UOC would show up to the council. We know at least 12 of them signed officially, formally, their consent to come. They didn't come because they were prevented. Many of them were prevented from coming to the council. And of course, it was really a short-sightedness of the leadership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church at the time. They believed that their self-isolation will help them. That was their sincere belief, and they were completely wrong as we see it now, because their self-isolation led them to the deadlock where they are now. If they were more kind of smarter, I would say, they would understand, would have understood at the time that it was to their best interest to participate in the council. Now the situation would have been completely different. We would not have need such a law as we are discussing now.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes, Professor Denisenko. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to both confirm what Father Cyril just said about the participation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the Unification Council, and I want to return to my refrain of not being prisoners of the moment in history. the fact that they refrained, or at least the vast majority of them refrained from participating in the council, contributes to the sort of story that we're finding ourselves in the moment now, of this being an anti-Ukrainian move. There was another question that I think I saw that maybe this helps to answer, is that this is a dynamic process. It might not feel like it, because it's only been 5 years since the Tomos has actually been given to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and in church history, 5 years is a very small amount of time. And in church history, rarely do we find the kind of univocality that the winners and the writers of church history tend to lay claim to. Usually there are dissidents, dissenting opinions, people who stand in opposition to decisions of church councils, whether they're local or ecumenical, for very long periods of time, some of which date from the year 451 and even before, that still remain unresolved. All of which is to say that in terms of this, if this is still a dynamic process, and if there is still some kind of possibility for the situation to move towards resolution, what I think we need to observe is how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, currently under the leadership of Metropolitan Onufriy, is going to relate to the other Orthodox churches, and in particular relate to Constantinople, because the Russian Church severed communion with Constantinople and with all of the bishops of the churches who agreed with the decision and recognized the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. If there is some kind of rapprochement, reconciliation, even at a beginning kind of a level with Constantinople, this would be an important signal of some kind of movement on the ground towards something new emerging. And what that will be, it's impossible to say. One can only predict or speculate. But once again, I think the important thing is that it's a short period of time. And from the perspective of church history, we may only be in the very beginning stages of a process that is still incomplete. And I know it's very hard to be patient when we think about that. But that's probably the reality, is that this process is just beginning.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments among the panelists? If not, we'll take a look at some of the questions that have been submitted. I have one. I'll read this in its entirety from Peter Galadza, Professor Peter Galadza. He says, remember that a significant issue regarding the use of Church Slavonic is the fact that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, insists on using the Russian pronunciation of Slavonic, which makes it sound Russian. This aspect is so salient that in Lviv, the cathedral, which is now within the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Epiphany's Church, and for many years within the Kievan Patriarchate, and thus very Ukrainian, could continue using Church Slavonic because they used the Ukrainian pronunciation of Slavonic. For all I know, they still use Slavonic with Ukrainian pronunciation, though I haven't been in the OCU Cathedral in Lviv since COVID. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate could do itself a real favor by just changing the pronunciation of 2 letters. But so many of their people consistently insist that the Russian pronunciation is the only proper Slavonic pronunciation. They aren't interested in the PR benefits of admitting that even dead languages have a living dimension. So any responses to that?
I think Father Nicholas is the most appropriate one to respond to.
Thank you, Father Cyril. I think that in terms of the language conversation in the Orthodox orbit, that there's an alignment of those who have supported autocephaly also adopting Ukrainization. really historically there was interest, the main objective originally before even going for autocephaly among the Ukrainians, the original pioneers of the movement for Ukrainian autocephaly was to adopt modern Ukrainian as the liturgical language. Historically speaking, when the Russian bishops in Ukraine denied that, and when the Ukrainian Council of 1918 formally adopted Church Slavonic, then some of the Ukrainians on their own created Ukrainian language parishes, which is a whole other conversation about parish property, to whom it belongs, a historical conversation that is somewhat on the periphery, I think, of our topic here. I think in terms of optics, of how this looks, though, that Father Peter Galadza has a point that some movement or even unofficial adoption of Ukrainian in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the leadership of Metropolitan Onufri would be some kind of unofficial signal of not an anti-Ukrainian stance, but of a pro-Ukrainian stance. That being said, you have to look at the entirety of it. And I'm not an insider, so I can't speak to this with any authority. But it seems to me, on the basis of at least anecdotal evidence, that there are Ukrainian language sermons. And I do know that there has been a publication of a Ukrainian language gospel book, and the use of that gospel book in some parish communities. So, the process of Ukrainization itself might not be to the satisfaction of those who want it to align with what we see in the Greek Catholic and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So in that sense, I think the issue has been politicized by all parties. But I think Father Peter has a point that even the adoption of Ukrainian pronunciation of Church Slavonic would be some kind of a signal on the part of those communities. That being said, it would be difficult for me to express any confidence that we would see any movement in that direction.
Thank you. We next have a message from Professor Zenon Vasiliou, who thanks you for the presentations. He has a class to teach and therefore has to excuse himself, but he will hear your response on the recorded version. And this is his question. Might you briefly address the role, if any, of diaspora churches, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA and Canada, the Orthodox Church of America, ROCOR, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, etc.?
Again, I think Father Nicholas is the one in the position to answer. I don't know.
Well, I would actually invite Father Cyril to a conversation on this, because in my opinion, I think that that the notion of this being unfinished business, of an incomplete process, and what might be possible concerning the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople is probably the pivotal issue. I mean, we've certainly seen media reports that there has been a renewal of a dialogue between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople. I don't want to, I neither want to overstate nor understate the potential role of the diaspora churches. Certainly they had an important role in the dialogues leading up to the attempt towards the unification process. But in terms of what's possible with the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople, I think there could be a conversation there, but it's hard to pinpoint where this is at, because again, we have a view into a process that is evolving and might be very slow. And I don't want to say much more about it because I don't know what kinds of conversations are happening in private between the leadership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and Constantinople, if anything at all. So I wish I could say more about that, but that's really all that I have for now.
Yeah, maybe I will add a bit to this. I agree with Father Nicholas's assessment of the situation. And certainly the roles of the churches vary. Well, most Orthodox churches, I would say, just ignore the war and the division within the Ukrainian Orthodoxy, even though some of those churches which ignore the war most, they appear to be quite vocal about the law, which is for me a sort of hypocrisy. You know, you keep a blind eye on the war, on mass killings, and you speak up and raise your voice about the law. This is an indication of disbalance in when it comes to assessing the law. And I agree with Father Nicholas about the exceptional role of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. It still is important, this role. And I believe the Ecumenical Patriarchate, particularly, I mean, personally, Patriarch Bartholomew, because even within the Ecumenical Patriarchate, there are different people and forces, you know, and opinions about both the war and, you know, and the situation in Ukraine. But personally, Patriarch Bartholomew is still very much in favor of the process of unification of the Ukrainian Orthodoxy. He still contributes to this process. I think there is a sort of symphonia, if you allow me to use this term, this Byzantine term, between the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the presidential office in Ukraine. At least there is a kind of synopsia looking into one direction. Towards the restoration of unity in Ukraine. It's difficult to achieve. It's much more difficult to achieve this unity or rapprochement than it was in 2018. I should say that both churches, but initially primarily the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, contributed a lot to the alienation after 2018. So now it's very difficult to undo this alienation, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And actually, some political forces and the Ecumenical Patriarchate, political forces in Ukraine, I mean, and the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and some people within those churches, both churches, they try to do something together in order to overcome this alienation.
Thank you. Any other comments on that? We now have a question from Professor Frank Sisson directed to Professor Volk. He writes, the Russian Orthodox Church views itself as the canonical head of all Orthodox in Ukraine, including the OCU followers. Hence, the idea that the claims of the Moscow Patriarchate create the link, whatever this institution in Ukraine, does seem questionable. Therefore, would not a claim of autocephaly and a condemnation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church put them into a similar situation as the Orthodox Church of Ukraine in relation to Moscow?
Well, I would be reluctant, you know, to comment on in what relations they will be in case they proclaim autocephaly. My point was probably was simpler, that based on the law, literally, the affiliation with the Russian Orthodox Church is described or is defined via the position of the Russian Church, not the Ukrainian Church. As long as the Russian Church recognizes the USC a part of itself, the state will have an instrument to ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and that's all. It's very difficult to justify that definition when you rely on the approach in Ukrainian church-state relations. You rely on the approach of the Russian Church, and this creates an instrument that will be in the state's hands forever. And maybe it's just as Father Kirill said, just a populist move. You know, to show the voters of certain political parties that we are working on this. But I would say that legal instruments and legal norms are never just populist moves, because at some point there will be a person who would like to use this instrument, and he or she will be able to do it.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Danilo Lishchishin at Northwestern University, who asks, thank you for all your presentations. Pivoting the discussion outside of intra-Orthodox and church-state relations, how do you think the law has affected wider interconfessional relations in Ukraine? Anybody? Yes.
If I may try to answer briefly this question. Well, certainly, there are some religious groups in Ukraine that still feel vulnerable in the Ukrainian situation. Well, given the Orthodox majority and the support that the state demonstrates to this majority somehow, at least some people believe so, and that would mean that those religious groups, minorities in the position of vulnerability, would be hesitant to support this law. And yet they have supported it through the All Ukrainian Council of Churches, Religious Organizations. That includes like Muslim communities, Jewish communities, and so forth, and Protestant Christian communities in addition to the Catholic and the Orthodox. So it's quite surprisingly to me, I should say, I was a bit surprised that this council unanimously endorsed the law, which means that even those minority groups, which are usually vulnerable, they decided to throw their support to this law.
Yes, Dr. Volk.
Well, first of all, I was also surprised by that sort of quite Soviet style, the meeting of President Zelensky with the All Ukrainian Council of Churches. Well, all religious communities supported the law. I would say that I'm not so surprised that several Protestant groups supported the law first, because the law does not only contain rules regarding the religious organizations affiliated with Russia, it also provides some very useful regulation for religious organizations that those Protestant groups have been promoting for quite a while. The law contains several provisions that will make the operation of religious organizations not affiliated with Russia, their operation in Ukraine, easier, which means that there is a very practical sense to support that law. But I would add that, in my view, overall, the support of the law seems to be quite a risky strategy, because first, if the law is implemented, not just proclaimed, but is implemented, and the UOC will be destroyed as a structure, and somehow Ukraine will manage to create one Orthodox church, I would say that I personally see no sense in All Ukrainian Council of Churches, because after that, the Unified Orthodox Church of Ukraine will probably claim to deal with the state directly, and will probably claim some specific place in Ukrainian religious landscape. And we do see some signs of that process right now, because I can remind you that in 2022 we already had a draft law prescribing, among other issues, that only those Orthodox communities can operate in Ukraine that are approved by the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And this is a very interesting concept that we can discuss. Obviously, as for now, we can't say that the law or other state policies, they affected other religious minorities or other religious groups beyond the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, historically and canonically affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate. But again, I'm recalling an opinion expressed publicly by one of experts involved in the religious examination of the link between Ukrainian church and Russian church, who said that, it's not just about Russian world, it's also about some other ideas like Euro-Asianism. I can't pronounce this. Eurasianism, yeah, which probably can be applicable to some, for example, Protestant groups who were, before the invasion, who were closely in touch with Russian Protestants and so on and so forth. So I think that there is something that we can think about here. And again, if we check the history of other post-Soviet states, we will see that the strengthening of the power of the state in religious affairs in all post-Soviet countries, with no exceptions, maybe except Baltic states, is one-way road. There are no examples when the states become stronger, and then they then say that, no, we don't need this power, we will be more neutral, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that it's just, very abstract discussions about that risks that can be after the implementation of this law.
Right, thank you. Anyone else on that? Here we have a question from Professor Jose Casanova, who states, I miss any reference to the post-colonial context of this dynamic process. If we look at comparative contexts, the Church of England, Anglican, not only had to change its name to the Episcopal Church of the US, but also to cut completely its ties with the Church of England. Moreover, the law of religious freedom passed in Virginia by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, with the help of the Baptist minority, was directed against any continuing hegemony of the Episcopal Church in Virginia. Any comments on that? Yes, first, Dr. Hovedon.
Yeah, I also read the rest of the comments by Jose in the same vein, and more examples about in Americas, including Latin America, about how this anti-colonial movement led to the emancipation of the churches and drastic measures regarding the churches and by the churches themselves to distance themselves from the metropolis. Well, it's helpful, I believe, indeed, and those examples are valuable, especially if I try to explain, what is going on in Ukraine in the global South. I try to do it quite often, and the examples of post-colonial history and theology they help a lot to communicate to the local people what's going on in Ukraine. In Ukraine, however, it's not always easy to explain what is going on in the post-colonial or anti-colonial terms, because in Ukraine there are debates about whether the situations of post-colonialism and the concepts of post-colonial philosophy / theology are applicable at all to Ukraine. People say that no, we are above this. We are not a colony. We were never a colony of Russia, and our struggle is not really anti-colonial, some people would argue. Therefore, it depends on the context. So I believe it's helpful to use those examples in the context of the global South, but can be controversial in Ukraine.
Thank you. Dr. Volk, did you have a comment on that?
Yes, first of all, I probably partly second to Father Kirill points, because I'm still looking, as a lawyer, I'm still looking forward to reading about to what extent Latin American or North American experience is relevant to Ukraine. And I do think that at least there are some differences, obvious differences, that will require this sort of explanation instead of just replacing the country in this whole discourse from Latin America or Brazil or Argentina to Ukraine, because it seems like several differences are quite obvious. But and again, I might be wrong, but as I remember the history after American Revolution, I think there were a lot of Anglican priests who just who would like to preserve their loyalty to the empire, who just left the country. But what is more obvious for me as a lawyer, that there is a quite strong difference between the North American or American Revolution case and current Ukraine, because first of all, because there were no international human rights framework at that time. George Washington would have no problem with dealing with international human rights treaties. And the second point is that the United States didn't have a problem of European integration, which is a sort of global geopolitical goal for Ukraine. And in my view, again, I'm not a sociologist, but if Ukrainians would be asked to prioritize European integration and say spiritual decolonization, I would expect like overwhelming support of European integration, but not spiritual decolonization, if the Ukrainians would have to choose.
Professor Denisenko, you have a hand up there.
Yes, I just wanted to briefly comment with thanks to Professor Casanova for his comment, and I think it's two things that I think need to be folded into further conversations on this topic. The first is that if we look at this again as a process, as a number of events that are kind of clustered together. In 2016, before we even had the unification process officially begin in Ukraine of the Orthodox churches, the Verkhovna Rada sent an appeal to Patriarch Bartholomew on the eve of the convocation of the Council of Crete, asking him to grant autocephaly for the church in Ukraine. And an important part of the argument was to cast out the colony that Russia had established in Ukraine through the Orthodox Church. And those of us who have been studying the history of the church in Ukraine are familiar with this conversation of a fifth column or of a Trojan horse or of a colony established through the church. But that's an official appeal made from a state institution to the most highest ranking patriarch of the Orthodox patriarchs that becomes part of the historical narrative. And I think we need to pay attention to that. And also related in the larger political context of what's happening with the war right now, we also have a similar, not as much talked about, but a similar situation happening in Estonia, where there is an attempt in Estonia to at least minimize, if not eliminate altogether, the Russian Orthodox Church and the Orthodox churches in Estonia. Now, that process is not necessarily a copy of what's happening in Ukraine, but I think it's something that we need to pay attention to because it shows that this is not an isolated incident. And so I think Professor Casanova, we owe him a debt of thanks for raising this issue and bringing our attention to it.
Thank you. I see now that Professor Casanova has a sort of addendum to his comments, so I'll just read it for the benefit of those of you who did not see it. He writes, similarly, after independence in Latin America, when most Catholic bishops sided with the colonial regime, as a consequence of the conflict between the new Republican regimes and the Vatican, most dioceses were left vacant throughout Latin America for several decades. So I think that's just further evidence of his point. Any comments, further comments on that issue? So I think we covered it. There is a question from Vasily Maximishinich, who writes, Father Nicholas spoke about the difference between independence and autocephaly, and often certain Ukrainian politicians demand a proclamation of autocephaly or joining the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Don't you find this to be state interference in the canonical sphere? Any responses to that?
I'll answer this question first and invite the other panelists to chime in. I'll be brief. I think that the important point here that caught my attention was Dr. Vov's discussion of the expert committee that reviewed the statute of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to determine whether or not it had actually ended relations and truly was independent of the Russian Orthodox Church. Because I think that what I've found, at least in listening and in paying attention, is I've been somewhat surprised at the amount of disagreement, at the degree of disagreement among Ukrainians who are discussing this issue on what degree of independence is actually needed and what needs to be demonstrated. I don't know if it's a univocal, well, they have to be canonically autocephalous, as I saw in another comment in the Q&A, would be difficult to achieve without there being some kind of a protest in the Orthodox world, given our current climate. If they were to declare autocephaly, I think one could anticipate that there would be immediately, a rejection of that autocephaly, or perhaps a call for pan-Orthodox council to make a decision on the Ukrainian issue. These are all things that we've seen before. So I think that the fact that you have a religion expert committee essentially say that the statute is still demonstrates some subordination to the Russian Orthodox Church And if I am not mistaken, someone can correct me here, I think that there was a previous examination of the statute, not by a committee, but by the predecessor to the current person who chairs the Department of Ethnic Affairs in Ukraine, saying that they had satisfied those requirements. All of which is to say that there's disagreement on this issue. And I think that it's that kind of conversation that makes it difficult to say that this is state interference. That again, is it interference? Is it persecution? What are the criteria by which we would say that it's interference or persecution? We need to have a conversation on that topic.
Thank you. Dr. Volk?
Well, at least just a response, at least from the perspective of the law, there is a very simple criteria. It's the recognition of the Russian Church that Ukrainian Church is not a part of the Russian Church. Before that, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is considered to be the part of the Russian Church. So unless Patriarch Kirill agrees with that, there will be no discussion whether they're affiliated or not, according to the law, I emphasize. And as a side comment, I think it's very interesting because somehow we managed to find ourselves in this situation when the whole discussion over that law as a measure of national security is completely, purely theological. We discuss decolonization, we discuss spiritual liberation, spiritual independence, autocephaly, Second Thomas, and so on and so forth. And while I fully support, I can't participate in the discussion, I have no idea what does it mean, but this is actually not at least what I would expect as a human rights lawyer as a discussion of national security, at least from the perspective of international human rights law, because I would expect whether the church is involved in some sort of support of the Russian military, whether the church, I don't know, torpedoes mobilization in Ukraine, whether the church, conducts some sort of propagandistic pro-Russian activities, and so on and so forth. And instead, the whole discourse, I emphasize, the whole discourse is a discourse of spiritual liberation and decolonization. Again, that could be a political discourse. Obviously, the church, and I think the Ukrainian Orthodox Church affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate, yes, they did a lot of to be criticized and to be blamed for especially what they did before the invasion. But you can't base your national security measures on just a purely theological discourse.
We have next Rostislav Smik asks, to Father Nicholas's point about a process, how much is the Russian Orthodox Church's use of soft power with other Orthodox churches, e.g. the Serbian Orthodox Church, to keep them from recognizing the Orthodox Church of Ukraine? Better said, how much is the ROC hindering the process?
I'll be very brief in answering this question. Maybe this takes us off topic a little bit in terms of the discussion of the law. Recent history shows us that there have been many opportunities for the Russian Orthodox Church to grant autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church even before the unification process. Of the many ones that I would identify, the most obvious is in 1991 to 1992, when the Episcopate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church appealed to Patriarch Alexei II and the Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church to grant them autocephaly. And in April 1992, that petition for autocephaly was denied. And there's a whole history involved here with this process. And I recall in some of the reading that I did in the lead up to that conversation, a concern that this was politically motivated. And here, Father Cyril is the one who wrote the book on these various autocephaly in his book on scaffolds on the church, which I've recently consulted for something that I've been working on, where he shows that political agents are always involved in these modern autocephalies that we see kind of take on the model of a nation state. And so I think that that on the one hand, that there's always a political motivation for autocephaly when you have an emerging nation state that establishes its sovereignty and wants to have a church that's free from some kind of foreign influence for one reason or for another, and sometimes for multiple reasons. But here within this process, there have been many chances for the Russian church, even as recently as 2017, to give autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and it hasn't done so. And again, I think that this takes us a little bit outside of the conversation of the process, but it seems to me that the point of no return on the chance to grant autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, that may have already reached its expiration date. But I would invite more conversation on that topic as well, because I don't think this is an isolated incident in how the church relates to the state in Orthodox majority or even Orthodox as large minorities in sovereign nation states. I don't think Ukraine is an isolated incident in episode in this regard.
Any other comments? I hope, with your indulgence, that we can continue. It's past 10:30, but I actually anticipated the discussion would go until about 11. So if everyone is agreed, let us continue with the questions. We have several more questions. All right. So next, Felix Corley asks, on the subject of religious freedom issues in government-held Ukraine, we should note the continuing denial of the rights of conscientious objectors to mobilization and the pressure and torture of some conscientious objectors in recruitment offices and military units. It's not really a question, but a comment, perhaps, inviting further comments. Yes, Dr. Volk.
Well, this is true. We have a few cases when conscientious objectors were denied the right to alternative service. And it's a separate issue and it's a separate problem, because we still, there is a significant concern from the European Union about that and other international religious freedom actors. But it's also about, in my view, it's also about the role of religion and politics, because when it's about this law about banning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church for its Russian ties, when it's a sort of utilization of religious factor for certain political needs, we can have this discussion and can have these laws adopted quite quickly, or at least we can have some sort of result. But conscientious objections, nobody is actually interested in them, and nobody wants to deal with that, because the idea of the objection during the wartime is unpopular in Ukrainian society, is being criticized by the Ukrainian military. And those people, they are now in jail, and some of them are serving their terms and sentence, and more or less, if there is no concern from the European Union, nobody cares. So when it comes to purely religious issues, that can actually be easily fixed. We see that more or less nobody cares.
All right. Any other comment? Question from Vsevolod Petriev. I am unclear what is meant by the UOC during this discussion. Can you clarify? I ask this question because it is my understanding that there are at least two versions of Ukrainian Orthodox Church, especially within Ukraine, those that follow the Moscow Patriarch and those that do not. That distinction is key to any discussion of Ukrainian Orthodoxy, including the new law. However, the labels used during this discussion to identify those two flavors are not clear to a layperson. Thus, we help continue cloud the discussion rather than clarify it. So I take this as just a request for clarification.
I think Father Nicholas is wanting to answer, right?
Yes,
Father Nicholas,
if I may, just very briefly, I express my sympathy to the commenter. These labels are constantly changing, and once again, the official name of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which we often know as the UOC MP, or in Ukrainian Uputsa Empa, their official name is Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And so ever since May 27, 2022, when they had their Sobor and declared their independence and claimed that they weren't part of the Moscow Patriarchate, it's I'm trying to stay up to date on names and labels. And we already had this with the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and with the very limited reinvigoration of the Kievan Patriarchate as well. And it complicates the issue. You're absolutely correct. In my presentation, when I say Ukrainian Orthodox Church, I'm referring to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church led by Metropolitan Onufriy, which the law in Ukraine is the topic of our discussion. And when I refer to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, or the OCU, this is the structure that emerged from the unification process in 2018 to 2019. And my understanding is that the other two panelists also are using the acronyms or abbreviations in the same way.
Okay, I hope that is clear. We just have a message from the president of the Shevchenko Scientific Society, Helena Hrin, who would like to say, on behalf of the board of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the US, I'd like to thank the panelists and moderator for a wonderful presentation and discussion. We are very grateful. Nevertheless, I think we can still take a couple of questions. We don't have many left. An anonymous attendee asks about regarding decolonization. Could the Ecumenical Conference of Theologians of the Ukrainian Orthodox and Greek Catholic churches dialogue help in the process of the Kievan theological and ecclesiastical heritage? Yes, Archimandrite Cyril.
If I may briefly answer, the answer is very simple. Any dialogue may help. That's exactly what we need regarding anything in Ukraine. That is the problem. We don't have dialogues between the churches. Even if you take like the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the Orthodox Church, and the Greek Catholic Church, there is no much dialogue between them. So we need it. So.
Thank you. We have a question from Father Ivan Koschak. Do you think that the basic right to self-determination is clouded and often ignored for the sake of the imposition of imperial Russian models of church-state symbiosis? Anybody want to take that on? Dr. Volk?
Again, just a side comment. I think it's when we compare Ukraine with the United States in terms of religion-state relations and say that Ukraine is somehow distant itself from Europe and more and closer to US, the situation around the law and the situation with the Ukrainian state is actually a way to say no, because when the Ukrainian state was quite weak and has no enough institutional power to interfere in religion-state relations, we was very close to the United States when nobody was a sort of institutional majority. But when the Ukrainian state has become strong enough, we do think that we are coming back to this Orthodox model with the demand of having one church that will be privileged and that will partner with the state to somehow determine and shape religious landscape in the country. And I would say that it's very important for Ukraine as a democratic state to preserve the model when the state is relatively weak and relatively neutral in religion-state relations, specifically because of this Orthodox and partly also communist heritage.
Other comments? No? So yes.
I just should add that it's not really a Russian model; it's a Byzantine one. It goes back to Constantine. It's very pertinent to the Eastern Christianity, and unfortunately, Ukrainian Orthodoxy is not completely free of it. We can see different incarnations of this symphony also in Ukraine on both national and local levels. Therefore, but I personally advocate for for the separation between the church and the state, and kind of overcoming this symphonic model. I should say it's not easy for the Orthodox nations to do this. A lot of internal work is required to do this. Usually, even in the EU, we see the churches, the nations that were shaped by this symphonic mentality, they continue to practice or to aspire for symphony. They Greece or Romania or, and it's EU. So to expect that the Ukrainians would be better than Greeks or Romanians, well, it would be great to be better than this symphonic relationship, but it's very hard to achieve. But we need to work on this.
Thank you. And we have a final comment from Professor Frank Sisson again, but it's a comment which I think could elicit further comments. Except for the US, he writes, modern autocephalies have always come after state intervention, such as Poland in 1924. So in a way, the Ukrainian state had to act. Any reactions to that?
If I can also very briefly say, I identify in my studies, several types of autocephaly. Imperial, Roman imperial autocephaly, then the Balkan medieval autocephaly, when the autocephaly supports an empire, and then the modern autocephaly. Most modern Orthodox churches emerged as modern autocephalies. Ukraine is just one of them. I call this the Balkan type of autocephaly, when an ethnic state emerges from an empire and postulates its independence and emancipation through autocephaly. So Ukraine just follows in the same line. And Ukraine is not an exception. It's just a delayed case of a Balkan autocephaly.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Denisenko.
Yeah, I appreciate both the question and Father Cyril's response. And I think that the whole matter of autocephaly has another discussion within the Orthodox theological community, where there was an attempt to finalize a mechanism for autocephaly leading up to the Council of Crete, one that never reached its completion because of disagreements. And I think that if the Orthodox Theological Academy and the bishops of the Orthodox Church were able to reinvigorate that conversation and find a solution to autocephaly, that it might contribute to the resolution of some of these issues, and also perhaps contribute to a more healthy symbiosis, if you will, of the way that the church relates to the state and liaisons with it, and maybe challenges it in its public discourse. But I think that we have to note that within Orthodoxy, there has been an urgency to resolve this problem of how autocephaly is granted, and it failed. But again, it's a dynamic process, and there's an opportunity to reinvigorate that process within the auspices of the Academy. And I think that it will be interesting to see what comes of the larger process of how autocephaly is granted and what autocephaly means within the Orthodox world.
Thank you. Any final comments? Very well. I appreciate all of your presentations, as well as your taking so many questions and discussing these matters. I'm grateful also to the organizers, Vasil Makhno, and to our technical assistant. And most of all, I appreciate all of you taking part in a discussion which will no doubt continue in Ukraine and beyond, and to which the Shevchenko Society is pleased to have made its contribution. Thank you very much.